In this video, we'll be talking about the stomach. First, a bit about the anatomy, and then a bit about the physiology. Okay, so gross anatomy first. And I want to make sure that you're all aware that by gross anatomy, I just mean the anatomy that's visible to the naked eye. I don't mean gross as in like you. So the stomach is basically the holding tank of your digestive tract. It can stretch from about 50 milliliters to hold 4 liters of food at maximum. So imagine two 2-liter soda bottles taped together. The stomach can expand to that big. Part of the reason why it can stretch so much is because when it is empty, it collapses into folds called rugae. These rugae are basically large folds in the wall of the stomach. You can see them there. The stomach is located tucked up under the liver, just below the diaphragm, on the upper left quadrant of the abdominal cavity. There are different regions of the stomach. The cardia is the region immediately where the esophagus empties into the stomach. That's why sometimes the gastroesophageal sphincter is called the cardiac sphincter. Not because it's in the heart, but because it is between the esophagus and the cardia region of the stomach. The fundus is kind of the part of the stomach that sits up above the cardia. The body is the main portion of the stomach. And then down here at the bottom of the stomach is the pyloric canal. That's the part that empties into the small intestine, which is why the sphincter at the end of the stomach is sometimes called, well, usually called the pyloric sphincter. The outer curve of the stomach is referred to as the greater curvature, and the inner curve is the lesser curvature because it's a little bit smaller. The stomach has a mucosa and submucosa. Its muscularis externa is a bit different. It actually has 3 layers instead of 2. Most of the digestive tract just has 2 layers. The wall of the stomach has 3 muscular layers, although that 3rd layer is not quite complete. But this extra layer allows for the intense pummeling and churning of the food bolus that's coming from the esophagus, so the stomach can really break that apart into chunks and mix it with the gastric juices. I've got some cadaver photos here to orient you to the gross anatomy of the stomach. Here we're looking at the abdominal cavity. There's a lot of small intestine there. Liver has been cut away, gallbladder. This is the stomach. It's empty. And then the different regions of the stomach highlighted here: the cardia, the fundus, the body, and the pylorus. With just a little bit of the small intestine, the duodenum of the small intestine there. Cutting away the side of the stomach lets us see the rugae, those folds, and the pyloric sphincter that controls passage of the stomach contents into the small intestine. So, like I mentioned, the stomach is the holding tank. It takes food, the food bolus from the esophagus, and turns it into what's called chyme. Chyme is basically just this partially digested, creamy paste that's a combination of food, partially digested food, saliva, and gastric juices. It's referred to as chyme. Now, this chyme is delivered to the small intestine in small little spurts, and that's because, if you notice, the small intestine is not super big. The small intestine can only really process small amounts of food in order to completely digest it and in order to completely absorb all of the nutrients it can. It needs to just be dealing with a small amount at a time. So this mass of food that's held in the stomach is only released in small little spurts through the pyloric sphincter. Now, while food is in the stomach, there's a lot that's happening to it. We mentioned the mechanical processing, that just pummeling or churning of food. You also have chemical digestion. You have enzymes that act on protein primarily. You have pepsin is an enzyme that digests protein. You also have a gastric lipase, which is an enzyme that digests lipids. So there's a very small amount of fat digestion that happens in the stomach, just like there's a very small amount of fat digestion that happens in the mouth. A really key function of the stomach is release of intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is absolutely essential for absorption of vitamin B12 in the small intestine. And this, incidentally, is actually the only absolutely required function of the stomach. If you need to have your stomach removed for stomach cancer or something along those lines, then you still can't eat as much. You don't have that holding tank facility, but you can still largely get most of the nutrients that you need. However, you will need to receive vitamin B12 injections if your stomach isn't functional, because you absolutely cannot absorb vitamin B12 unless you have intrinsic factor, which is made by the wall of the stomach. Now, there's no nutrient absorption in the stomach, but there is some drug absorption. Small amounts of ethanol can be absorbed in the stomach. Ethanol is lipid soluble, so it can cross the stomach wall. And aspirin can actually be absorbed in the stomach as well. But no real nutrient absorption. Now, when we're looking at the mucosa of the stomach, it's basically a flat surface, except for the rugae, but smooth on the rugae with pits embedded down into the surface of the mucosa. So the surface epithelium is up here, the mucosal pits extend down into the lamina propria. But then you still have the muscularis mucosae, you still have the submucosa, and then you have the muscularis externa, that third incomplete layer, the circular layer, and the longitudinal layer. And then it's in the abdominal cavity, so you've got a serosa on the outside of that. The gastric pit is this first part of the opening. The gastric gland is the lower part, where you start to see functional cells producing hydrochloric acid, cells producing hormones. The mucosa of the stomach is an abrupt change from the mucosa of the esophagus. If you look at the gastroesophageal junction, the place where the esophagus joins to the stomach histologically, it's a really abrupt transition. You can draw a straight line. And you can say on one side, you have the stratified squamous epithelium of the esophagus. And on the other side, you have the columnar epithelium of the stomach. Abrupt, sharp transition. Those gastric glands, the deep portion of the gastric pit, this is really where the functions of the stomach are initiated. You have mucous neck cells at the very beginning of the gastric gland. They secrete a thin acidic mucus. You also have parietal cells in here. These are the ones that are indicated in blue. The parietal cells are the cells that secrete intrinsic factor. So they're the cells that allow for vitamin B12 absorption. And they're the cells that secrete hydrochloric acid. The chief cells, located down at the bottom of the gastric glands, these are the cells that produce pepsin. Actually, they produce a precursor to pepsin called pepsinogen, and then the hydrochloric acid in the stomach activates pepsin. And so this hydrochloric acid really has a couple of different functions. The hydrochloric acid aids in digestion of proteins, so it actually denatures proteins. If you recall, if you think back to 241, proteins are normally kind of bundled up in knots, which if you have an enzyme wanting to come in and try to digest that protein, there's not a lot of points of access. But you add some acid, you denature that protein strands out, it's now like a continuous string, and now the enzyme can act anywhere along that protein. Okay, so that's the first function of HCl, is it denatures protein in your food. The second function is that it activates pepsin. Pepsin is secreted as an inactive precursor. The acidity, the hydrochloric acid, activates it, turns it to active pepsin, so that pepsin can come in and break apart proteins, digest proteins. Lastly, in the gastric glands, you have enteroendocrine cells, so hormone-secreting cells. They secrete a variety of hormones. Gastrin is primarily the most important one. They're secreted by G cells. Gastrin is secreted by G cells. And gastrin stimulates both acid production and stimulates gastric motility. And the release of gastrin is actually triggered by food in the stomach. So as soon as you get food entering into the stomach, the G cells release gastrin, you get more acid released, the stomach starts that contracting, that churning on food. So since hydrochloric acid in the stomach is really pretty important, so I want to talk a little bit about where that comes from. It's secreted by the parietal cells, so this image here is like we zoomed in on a single parietal cell in a gastric gland. If you look here at step 1, you have hydrogen ions being pumped into the stomach lumen by a transporter protein called a hydrogen potassium ATPase. So basically, this protein, this pumps hydrogen out into the stomach lumen and pulls potassium into the parietal cell. So it's a hydrogen-potassium exchange. And these hydrogen ions, they're coming from the action of carbonic anhydrase. So carbon dioxide is diffusing into the parietal cell. Carbonic anhydrase enzyme converts that to carbonic acid. The carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen and bicarbonate, and some of those hydrogen ions are pumped out. The chloride comes from the plasma. So you have chloride from the interstitial fluid basically being brought in by a bicarbonate chloride exchange protein. So this is where the bicarbonate from this carbonic anhydrase activity goes. It's passed out of the parietal cell in exchange for bringing chloride in. This is referred to as the alkaline tide because that bicarbonate tends to make the pH of the interstitial fluid in the stomach and the pH of the blood passing through the stomach a little more alkaline. So chloride is brought in to the parietal cell, and then it passes through a transport protein following the hydrogen ions into the stomach lumen. So the negatively charged chloride follows the positively charged hydrogen into the lumen. Hydrochloric acid is released in response to a number of different things. It's released in response to parasympathetic stimulation. So when you have parasympathetic activity, that promotes hydrogen chloride release. It's also stimulated in response to gastrin. Gastrin promotes hydrochloric acid release, and in response to histamine. The regulation of stomach function is pretty complex, and there are 3 phases. I don't want you to think of these phases as being like first this one happens, then the next one, then the third one. They're really overlapping, and they can all kind of happen at the same time. They're separated more by where they're occurring than when they're occurring. The first phase is called the cephalic phase, and this happens before food even enters the stomach. This is your cerebrum getting in on the activity, your conscious mind If you smell something tasty, if you taste food, if you see food, if you even think about food, that can actually trigger activity in the stomach. If you've ever had the experience of, seeing a burger commercial and your stomach starting to rumble, that's the cephalic phase. The second phase is the gastric phase. This is once food enters the stomach. You actually have stretch of the stomach and you have nutrients entering the stomach, triggers stomach activity. The intestinal phase occurs once food enters the duodenum of the small intestine. It's a brief excitatory component that's quickly inhibited by a reflex called the enterogastric reflex. So remember I said that you get just food or chyme by this point released into the small intestine in these quick little spurts from the stomach. That's because of this enterogastric reflex. So once food enters the duodenum, there's a really brief period where the pyloric sphincter opens and you get more food going into the small intestine, but then the duodenum starts to stretch, starts to get distended, and the enterogastric reflex closes it back up. Closes that pyloric sphincter up tightly so that you only get just a little burst of food released, and then it's closed for a moment. This is a slightly more visual way to look at those three phases of gastric regulation. And you've got both stimulatory events listed and inhibitory events. So if we're looking at the cephalic phase, you have sight and thought and taste and smell of food stimulating secretion and motility. If you lose your appetite, or if you're feeling depressed, or if you are in a stressful situation, this can lead to inhibition of gastric activity. In the gastric phase, you have stress receptors, mechanoreceptors activated by stomach distension, both local reflexes and parasympathetic reflexes through the vagus nerve acting on the stomach. Chemicals and a rising pH. So as food drops into the stomach, it neutralizes the acid in the stomach. pH rises, and that also stimulates gastrin release and increased stomach activity. In contrast, over here, if you are emotionally upset, you get the sympathetic nervous system activated. That overrides these parasympathetic responses. And if you have excessive acidity in the stomach, that can actually decrease gastrin secretion and decrease stomach activity. In the intestinal phase, this is the presence of either low pH from acid coming in from the stomach or partially digested food. In the duodenum, you get a brief release and then closing back off. And this is the enterogastric reflex over here, the inhibitory part of that reflex, triggered by distension of the duodenum. Okay, so the stomach is really a big player in the digestive tract. So you should be able to talk quite a bit about what the stomach does after studying this video. You should be able to talk about the gross anatomy of the stomach, compare it to the rest of the digestive tract, talk about how this anatomy is specialized for the functions of the stomach, talk a little bit about the histology of the stomach, the gastric pits and gastric glands, talk about the types of cells found in the gastric glands and what they do. Talk about the formation of hydrochloric acid, talk about the digestive activities that happen in the stomach, and talk about the cephalic, gastric, and intestinal phases of regulating stomach activity.